Now that we know how Photoshop handles text, it's time to see how we can use it more creatively. So you can see a couple of examples here, and this composition is a little bit too busy, of course. I wouldn't use all these elements together, but I just wanted to have an example where I can show you a few techniques that might help you in your own projects. So we are going to use some of those techniques we've learned before, like masking, smart objects, clipping masks, and paths, combined with typography. And then we will see exactly how this composition was created. So let me turn off this final version, and I'm going to go back to the original text. So in this layer group, I only have normal text. And we can start with this one at the bottom, the Reach the Summit text, which I have set up with an underline. When you have text selected and you are in the character formatting options, you just turn on this icon, which will add underline. And I'm using the font called Bebas, and as you can see, I increased the size really high, so it can fit that bottom area there. For this technique, the best fonts to use are the ones that's very condensed and thick, because what I want to achieve here is to see through the font and see the image behind it. But to make this work, I'm also going to use an element. So I'm just going to turn on these few elements here. And for now, let's just concentrate on this rectangle at the bottom. So I also created this earlier. It's just a white rectangle. But then what I will do is to select the image in the background and copy it. So I'm going to Alt click and drag it above the text that I would like to use. You will see that once it's copied, it will cover up everything underneath it. But then if I create a clipping mask out of this, so Alt click between the two layers, or Command or Control Alt G while that image is selected, will create a clipping mask. So now the text will show the image. So if I were to see this layer only, and I would turn off the background layer, you see that that image will only be visible within that text layer. And that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. And because the image that I copied is exactly in the same position as the main image in the background, that's why it seems like we are seeing through that rectangle. And we can always adjust this rectangle, so if we don't want it to go too high, we can always reduce it down. And there's another element here which I created, or this is actually a free asset that I downloaded from the cloud, and then I just position it here somewhere. Maybe I will make it slightly smaller. It's a vector asset. So I'll just show you how to download these. You go to the Creative Cloud application, choose Assets, Market, and you type in whatever you are looking for. I'm looking for mountains, or just mountain. If I spell it correctly, it might come up with the results. There you go. If I scroll down, I can show you this is the one I downloaded, which I will then be able to access from the Creative Cloud Libraries panel. So there's the mountain that I'm using. Now let's work with the Starts Here text. So I'm working my way up from the bottom. I'm going to select that layer, and as you can see, it's an editable text. But I would like to add a bit of perspective to this text. So I want to distort it in perspective. If I use the free transform tool and I hold down Command or Control and I start dragging that around, you can see I can skew the text, but it's not going to be a perspective distortion. The type of distortion you would get on layers, image layers, or smart objects. So the solution is to turn this into a smart object. Now if you use this on text, turning it into a smart object is better than rasterizing it, because rasterizing would get you to the same position I just showed you. So if I rasterize the layer, I can now use perspective distortion on it. But the problem is that it's not going to be editable anymore. So it's turned into an image. And that's not what I wanted. So I'm just going to undo, go back until it's still an editable text layer. And then I right click on it and choose Convert to Smart Object. It's best to do this with a bigger size of the text than what you actually need at the end, because that way the distortion will be more higher resolution, so it won't pixelate. But let me just add that distortion I wanted. So I'm going to hold down Command or Control on PC and add a bit of perspective distortion. It's really up to you how you want the text to distort. I'm just going to do something like that. I basically want the text look like it's coming from the mountains in the background. Okay, I think something like that will work. But the good thing about smart objects is that we can always come back and make changes to it. So if we feel like it's a little bit too much, we can always make changes to it. But I think that's quite nice. It shows that angle, that this text would just fly over the mountains if they were going that direction. But the best thing about turning it into a smart object was that we can still edit it. By double clicking on the smart object's thumbnail, we can go into the source of the smart object, and this text here is still editable. So if I were to change the color on it, for example, it's very simple, but of course you could change the text itself as well. I'm just going to switch to green on that text, and then to update this, first of all, I select accept the change on the text, and then I save this, file save. So that saves the file, and then I can close it, and you can see now it's updated. And also another thing about smart objects that I really like, that if I want to go back, if I don't like this change, so I want to turn it back to white, I don't have to go back into the smart object's source. I can just undo it from here, from within the main document. So if I choose step backward, you can see it will undo the changes that I've done within the smart object. Okay, so that's just another creative technique you can do with text. But now let's add some mask here for the word adventure. So first of all, what I'm going to do is to create a layer group and place the adventure text into that group. Then I select the group itself, and I will use the quick selection tool, with which I can make a selection of the sky. Now, it's better to have the text actually turned off when I do this, because I'm using sample all layers. And I will do it again quickly. So there's a better selection already. I'm just going to hold down Alt or Option to remove these parts that doesn't have to be in the selection. And I think I'm mainly going to use this area here. So this is the main part that has to work nicely. Something like that I think will work. So now I can turn back the text, and I'm going to turn this selection into a mask on that layer group. So I will click on the mask icon here at the bottom. Now if I move the adventure text, which is in that group, you will see it will only be visible in the sky. So it feels like the text is behind the mountains. Let me just turn off starts here for now, just so we can see it even better. So that is also another great way to add depth in your design. So it feels like this text is behind the mountains, which is exactly what I wanted to achieve. So to add some interaction in your design, it's not enough to just place text on top of the image. It's also useful to place text behind the image, or make it feel like it's behind the image. Achieving depth in general in graphic design is a key technique to make it more engaging. Because you work in 2 dimensions, anything that will make it look like there is depth or 3-dimensional composition will make it more exciting, and it will draw people's attention. So that's why this simple technique is also very effective. I'm just going to make it subtle. It doesn't have to be so obvious like that, because of course it will be difficult to read. And remember, it's always more important to keep it legible than to make it look cool. Okay, so first rule of typography is legibility, and then to make it interesting. So I have the starts here text just below this, which I can turn back on. And now we can work on the your ultimate text. So for this, I have another element here, by the way, that little star, which is also a text layer. That's a glyph that I used. If you remember, in one of the previous videos, we used this. I can just show you under type menu panels, you can find the glyphs panel. And that's actually a Wingdings character that I added. But there are several different versions here. I could choose another one as well if I want. But that's already there because this is the most recently used glyph. Although it looks more like an icon, that's actually also a font or text. So I'm just going to leave that there. But what I would like to work on now is the your ultimate text. So I'm going to select that one. And I will use the type tool. Once the type tool is selected and you have a text layer highlighted, you can then use the options from which we haven't used this so far, called text warp. So once I click on this, it will come up with this dialog box from which you can choose different shapes. One of the probably most common one is arc. Now if you use Word, it's similar to Word Art, the way this works. So you can see that I can bend the text around in different directions. And I can also add additional distortions like horizontal distortion, vertical distortion, and so on and so forth. What I like to use, one of the options is called Arch. And I'm going to just reset the distortions to 0 and 0. And if I increase the bend, you can see how that works. So I am actually happy with something simple like that. You don't have to be using the bend too high because it's going to distort the text too much and it will make it hard to read. So I'm just going to use something like that. But of course, we could always use vertical distortion as well, slightly, maybe something like that, to have a little bend on it as well. And then if we click OK, that is now a text warp layer. You can see the icon changed. So if I want to edit the warp itself, I can still do that whenever I want. I can go back, make edits. I can choose different style as well. And the best thing is that you can also edit the text straight away. And I'm going to add the drop shadow on this, just so it separates more from the text behind it. Something like that. I will click OK. And also I might go back and edit the warp option on it. And I'm going to just make the bend a bit more subtle, and maybe I remove this vertical distortion. I didn't actually like it. Okay, something like that. And we can also add tracking on here. So if I press Alt right arrow, I can expand it slightly and there's a little bit more space on it. So now I can resize it until I get the shape I wanted. So you see, there's a lot of different things you can do and combine. And of course, we can make our drop shadow also a little bit more visible. So we can make the spread a little bit higher and also maybe the size a bit higher, something like that. That works quite nicely. So now I can click OK. And now let's focus on the next text element, the Conquer the Summit and Your Fear text. So this is actually going to be used here, following the shape of the mountain. For this, we need to have a path created. So using the pen tool, for example, set to path mode, you can create a shape. Try to use always curved lines, because with sharp edges, your text will split into strange formations. It prefers to have smooth lines, so curved lines. But I actually have that path created already, so I'm just going to select it. You can see it's there. And it just roughly follows the shape. It doesn't follow it exactly, but it's nice and smooth, so the text will flow on it perfectly. So if I just select this text using Command or Control A, I selected and highlighted all the text. Then I press Command or Control C to copy it. That's all we needed, so we can put this away. Now I use the Type tool, and notice when I hover over the path, it changes. The cursor changes, and when you see this cursor, that means you can click on the path and then place the text in. So now it's edited on the path, and once it's on the path, you can of course still edit it, so it's still editable text. Plus, you can also make changes to it with the right arrow tool, the direct selection tool. We could, for example, move the beginning point. If I hover here where it begins, I can move that around, and then the text travels on the path. So I can decide exactly where to start. I could even drag it down, and then the text goes to the bottom instead being on the top of the path. Okay, and there's many things you can do when you have text on paths. And of course, it doesn't have to be an open path like this one. It could even be a circle. So if you use shape tools in Photoshop, you can also add text around them or even within shapes. So there's lots of things you can do once you start combining tools in Photoshop. And this is just a simple example of that. But to finish off this example, I am going to switch back to my layers, and I will turn off the other version of Conquer the Summit text on the top. And let's just come back to this star. So as I said, this is also a text it's a letter or a glyph from a font. And what I can do with this is to turn it into a 3D object. If I go to the 3D menu, I can choose new 3D extrusion from selected layer, or I could also highlight the text and choose 3D from here in the type tools option bar. If I click on that one, that will take us into 3D editing mode. And this is something I'm going to talk about in another video briefly. But for now, I just wanted to show you that this became a 3D object, which I can turn around. We can also see another view of it there on the left. And we can, of course, change attributes. So if I don't want it to be so deep, I can just go to my properties panel, which is down here. And then I can change the extrusion depth. So I can decide exactly how deep I want it to be. Let's say something like that. And then I can rotate it around until I get the shape I wanted. So it becomes more like a token. And then if I switch back to another layer, which doesn't use 3D, we will see it normally. We could select our adventure text and do the same thing. So I use the type tool, click on 3D, and immediately it turns into 3D. And look at that. I mean, that's a very effective way to highlight the text also. And now, once again, we combine two things. We have 3D used on this text, and also we have masking there. So I can again go back to my properties panel, reduce the extrusion depth. I don't like it when it's too deep. And I can now drag it around again and find the best angle, something like that. So even more effects added here. And as I said, it's a little bit too busy and too crazy. There's too many things going on. But I just wanted to show you in one example, several techniques that you can use to make your composition more creative and more exciting. And maybe just one last thing, if I move this down a bit, I think that just give it a bit more space. And also this text can go slightly above, and also that token, and it could even be somewhere there, but I'm just going to keep it somewhere there on the top. Okay, so all these techniques, by the way, are also non-destructive, so everything is still editable. If I don't like my mask, I can shift click on it, then the text immediately comes in front of the mountains. If I wanted to push it back, I can do just that. I can edit my path as well. If I don't like the way it looks, I can select that layer, and using the white arrow, I can select points in this path, for example this point here, and move it around, and you will see changes on the path will change the way the text is flowing. So everything is still editable. All the text I can still type and make changes to. Even the 3D text can be edited. So that's all I wanted to show you in this video. I hope you found it useful. But now we are ready to move on to another important topic, how to save and share the work that you do in Photoshop. So that's exactly what I'm going to show you in the next video.